This month is the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, which took place in October of 1917. So I thought, in commemoration of that event, hailed by some as the greatest single event in human history, that it would be worth giving some thoughts on it. I'm certainly not going to hammer on about theoretical interpretations. Anyway, my ideal audience is people who aren't particularly interested in politics, or who are sceptical or regarding left politics, or have no real idea about it. So I just want to say some simple facts, and I want to really just focus on the one-sidedness of the historical interpretations, which generally come from a right-wing point of view and from a pro-capitalist point of view and a pro-establishment point of view. You know, history is indeed written by the winners, so you do get very much a one-sided interpretation of what happened. Now, from the get-go, I'm not going to deny that the Soviet Union was a crap place. I wouldn't particularly want to live there. It was a one-party dictatorial regime, extremely oppressive, undemocratic. People would be disappeared to gulags for questioning authority in any way, shape or form. People would be killed. Certainly during the reign of Stalin, the death toll was catastrophic. The peasants died in their millions because of economic mismanagement. There were deadlines to produce certain levels of grain for the cities as a part of the 5-year plans. You know, Stalin, it worked, but Stalin had the idea of turning it from an agrarian, feudal, peasant countryside economy into an industrial powerhouse, and he wanted to do that very, very quickly. Then he did bread for the dense population of workers in those urban environments, and therefore these deadlines had to be met. People were terrified of it not being met because of the consequences. It wasn't a very forgiving regime, so they just got that bread, got that grain, and got it to where it needed to be, regardless of any other considerations, which meant that all of the bread, all of the grain, all of the foodstuffs were literally ripped out of the peasant communities, and they starved to death in their millions. So, you know, Stalin certainly was a bit of a piece of shit as far as I'm concerned. Che Guevara famously visited the Soviet Union, had a look around, and went back to the airport, and before he jumped on the plane went back to Cuba, he said, if this is socialism, you can keep it. And I'm in agreement with him. So things obviously went catastrophically wrong in terms of the after effects of the revolution itself in Russia. But the point is, why did that happen? I think it's very important, and what a time to be celebrating for some, to reconsider for others, and just to be aware of the fact that it is the 100th, the centenary of the Russian Revolution. What a time to be alive. What a time to be around. In many ways, a terrifying time. A time of struggle and torment. Certainly there are many people on the left. I'm consistently infuriated by their inability to understand just how shockingly terrible and difficult it is just to get by on a day-to-day basis. You know, I've harped on about that a few times already. But what a time to be celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, with the things that are going on in the Western world, with the seismic shifting in politics, the beginnings of a fight back across broad sections of the population across the Western world. So I think to just point out some of the hypocrisy and one-sidedness of those things which are fired at the Russian Revolution. But not forgetting, as I've said, absolutely, that the Soviet Union itself was a shitty place, and I wouldn't want to live there. I wouldn't want a society to develop which in any way, shape or form mirrors it. So I'm just going to focus on the hypocrisy. Now, one of the hypocrisies is that whenever you have the left reach ascendancy, where they become strong, that somehow it's the warning of Russia, the Soviet Union. You hear it particularly from the right, the far right, any critic of Corbyn in this country, for example, of trade unions, when working class people and their organisations begin to get more confident and more influential and more powerful and begin to fight back. It's an old cliche, not been heard for quite some time, which is in itself is extremely interesting. But, get back to Russia, we're going to end up in some kind of Soviet system. It absolutely was not inevitable that the Stalinist dictatorship that you would end up with a Stalinist dictatorship as a consequence of the socialist revolution in Russia in 1917. That's just actually a ludicrous historical interpretation and position to take. The evidence completely chops it to pieces. It's a common argument which is fired at the population by the establishment because they wouldn't want people to think that revolution or revolutionary upheaval or the masses fighting back is in any way justified or could ever in any way lead to significant improvements in the living standards of the broad mass of the population. The whole history of civilization is a history of revolution and conflict between forces within society that reach such a breaking point that there is a snapping and there are upheavals that completely wipe away the old systems of society and give birth to new ones. And it's where all of the progress comes from, whether they be small individual progresses in terms of race relations and in the way that we think about gay people, in the way that we think about ethnic minorities. Massive subjects, of course they are, Jesus Christ, and the way that they affect people and the history of how they've affected people. But nonetheless, just singular subjects within a broader society, particularly as they develop and tick over in the contemporary Western world in particular. Or, it's fighting back, it's struggling, it's movements of campaigning, raising issues, chipping away, sometimes over years, until a point is reached where there is a crack in the dam, it breaks open, and the world changes forever, and attitudes change forever. Well, sometimes those same mechanics operate on a larger scale in terms of entire societies, and sometimes the entire civilization of the world, and things can take place which are earth-shattering, game-changing. The master theme of the epoch was the way in which Percy Bysshe Shelley referred to the French Revolution. And in many ways, the Russian Revolution was the master theme of the epoch at its time. John Rees wrote his famous book, 10 Days That Shook the World, and it did shake the world to its very core. It was a game-changing moment. The working masses, the peasant masses, the common soldiery decided they'd had enough, and they fought back. They set up their own democratic organisations in the form of Soviets, that's where the word comes from, and they took control of the country. There was a situation of dual power where you had a government after the Tsar had stepped down, abdicated, and the workers in their Soviets, the peasants in their mirs, I believe they were called, kind of peasant councils, and they were organising and running and operating that society. It is true that it didn't last a very long time, but why did things go so catastrophically wrong? Well, to sum it up fairly quickly, there was a war, a civil war, between those people who were the ruling elites and their allies, who were terrified of their wealth and their prestige and their system and everything that they believed in, everything that they held dear, being swept away in a revolutionary tsunami. They were going to fight back. They're never going to give these things up without a fight. And it was a very bitter, very brutal, very murderous civil war which ripped the country to pieces, and terrible atrocities were carried out on both sides. But the fog of war and the fog of revolutionary war isn't always a pretty thing. But one of the consequences of that civil war and 21 armies of imperialist intervention, it was France, it was Britain, it was the United States of America, it was Japan in the east, literally surrounded Russia, 21 armies to crush that revolution because they were so terrified of it spreading to other parts of the world. The cream of the revolution, the socialists and the anarchists and the activists and the Soviet leaders and organizers were on the front, and they were fighting and dying. The cream of the revolution were wiped out in that war. It left massive gaps. Those gaps had to be filled by somebody, so that the organic democratic structures of the Soviets were taken charge of in an emergency situation, and they tended to become simplified, not as democratic, and more bureaucratically operated out of necessity in the short term, but that distortion eventually became the norm. Again, there were shortages. There were shortages of the working class people who had, illiteracy was enormous. They didn't have the skills, the education, or the experience they had the passion and the intelligence and the imagination, but just, if you just threw me into a bank and said, right, run that bank, I wouldn't know what I was doing. The damn thing would collapse. So, you need specialists. But the specialists who were given those jobs were the same people who were specialists under the previous regime. And slowly you began to get a bureaucracy develop. Stalin was put in a position of leadership as a temporary measure because he was always a bit of a rotten egg, a bit of a dodgy one in the barrel. And people knew that and were aware of it. There were warnings about, keep your eye on this guy. But he was a strong man, a hard man, basically. In fact, his name Stalin means man of steel, Stalin, the steely one. It was a code name that he had when he was a revolutionary on the run prior to the revolution. So he then became the head of this developing bureaucracy, which became powerful and began to develop a significant amount of privilege and influence. The Bolsheviks themselves, the leaders of the revolution, began to speak up about that. They were purged. Stalin wiped them all out. Krupskaya, the wife of Lenin, after Stalin's death, she probably wouldn't have got away with it, other than the fact that she was who she was, said that if Lenin had have lived, he would have ended up in one of Stalin's prisons. So that bureaucratic distortion became the bureaucratic norm. He took care of the cream of the revolution. He had them all exterminated. There is a famous photograph of Stalin, along with all the other leaders of the revolution. By the early 40s, they were all dead. I believe Kamenev and Zinoviev might have lived a bit longer. But he literally wiped all of them out. And then began to establish the dictatorship and the Soviet style of communism as we now think of it in the aftermath of those events. Now, Russia from the get-go was also backward. It was economically backward and socially backward. It wasn't an advanced country in any way. And the leaders of the revolution knew that if they remained isolated, the revolution would degenerate. They wouldn't be able to establish socialism in an advanced way because of that backwardness, that it would degenerate into bureaucracy and social backwardness and even potentially dictatorship. But unfortunately, those revolutions which did take place in other parts of the West, in the advanced Western world, were unsuccessful, and Russia did become isolated. Stalin himself later referred to the issue of not being able to have a revolution in one country that it would need to be backed up by successful revolutions in others, where they would operate economically and assist each other in the way that they would move towards a more advanced form of structured democratic socialist operation. And Stalin referred to Lenin and Trotsky's position of that you can't have a revolution in one country as a storm in a teacup. So these things did happen, these things went wrong, but don't let people give you a very simplistic, very one-sided interpretation of history and remove from your mind the idea that whenever people fight back, it's going to end badly. The reason that they point these things out isn't because they think, oh, it would be really bad for the people. Clearly it's not that. Oh, it would be really undemocratic. I mean, it might be a mess, and we've got such a heartfelt concern for the population of our own country and the population of other countries. Do you really think that they have? So you should really be asking yourself, why do they give such a one-sided interpretation of those events? Missing out things like it was a spontaneous movement of the workers and poor masses of Russia and the peasantry, and that they did set up their own democratic institutions which were running the country. The reason is that they are terrified of that happening, and you'll be hearing a lot of shit, no doubt, during this centenary. So in conclusion, I just want to read one of my favourite quotes. The lighting isn't great here. The most indubitable feature of a revolution is the direct interference of the masses in historic events. In ordinary times, the state, be it a monarchy or a democracy, elevates itself above the nation, and history is made by specialists in that line of business. Kings, ministers, bureaucrats and parliamentarians, politicians. But at those crucial moments when the old order becomes no longer endurable to the masses, they break over the barriers excluding them from the political arena, sweep aside their traditional representatives and create by their own interference the initial groundwork of a new regime. The history of a revolution is for us, first of all, a history of the forcible entrance of the masses into the realm of rulership over their own destiny. Thank you for listening. Please like, comment and subscribe.